behavior is a form of communication pillar number 8. Really, for me, what it was I got hired right out of college. This big former college wrestler, they wanted me to coach wrestling. And I know my elementary principal at that time looked at me like, oh God, this guy's gonna come in and work with first graders. And he gave me an article, physically handed it to me and said, I want you to read this. And that was like the second time I met him. The first time was the interview. So I was good enough to get hired, but I know he had some nerves around my methodologies, probably because my appearance. Maybe it was unfair for him to judge me, but I would admit that he was probably right in some of his assumptions, right? I was this guy turning boys into men, and I know it was elementary based, but I definitely had some work to do on myself being a brand new teacher. And at 24 and a half years old, he handed me this article and it said behavior was a form of communication. And I understood real quick his style and his philosophy, and that there was usually going to be a story behind some of these behaviors that I see, And later in my career, through therapeutic crisis intervention, which I've mentioned once already around the brain, I learned that you can either be the educator, which is highly effective or affective, right? Or you can be the firefighter, which I would argue would be the highly effective. Highly affective would be the educator, right? But you might be effective and put a fire out, but it didn't necessarily have value or bring an impact to whatever the situation is when someone's in crisis. And then the third thing that you can be, which a lot of people can fall into, I have in my career, is an abuser. And you're an abuser when you might belittle, or you kick someone out, or you just hammer them with a detention. So every behavior is a form of communication, and it's your response in therapeutic crisis intervention is how am I feeling and how is the student feeling? And then, that's the language. And then, trauma informed isn't what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. That's the language in trauma informed caregiver. So just the idea of understanding that, when a kid spits on the floor, which I've had happen, he's telling me something. It's definitely shocking, and it raises my emotions, but he's telling me something. And understanding is not condoning. It's not okay to spit on the floor. We did a mini restorative circle and restored the community harm. But I think that it's important to know that some of these kids that challenge us the most have some of the most intense stories to share.
Tell her about Dan.
Well, it was a struggle. He had some issues and would challenge the teachers. Of course, he had a good connection with the phys ed teacher, me. But I just remember this one situation where he had brought a knife to school, and that's a pretty big deal. Certainly a much bigger deal today than it was then, but it was definitely a big deal then too. Didn't threaten anyone, but he had it with him, and I probably showed it to somebody and they found out. And a lot of the teachers, understandably, were really up in arms and were seeking maybe suspension, but longer term, what's to say he's not going to do it again. And my thought process in this thread of all CC'd team, most middle schools run on team approaches where there's different groups of teachers that they're going to see, and they work together and collaborate. And just among the team, I shared, what was he trying to tell us? He was obviously struggling, and it wasn't necessarily let's get rid of him, let's suspend him. What's he going to do next? It's he's telling us something. And there's a message there. When a kid brings a knife to school, there's a reason, and let's get to the bottom of that reason. And that was just a different perspective than everyone else had. And I think some of the ugliest behaviors, or most challenging ones, usually have some of the ugliest stories that go with them, and it doesn't make it easy. And there's been, I had a kid pass gas while I was talking on purpose a few times, and I ignored it. And like I said earlier, I flanked him. I came back around, I got class going. A few kids were barely holding it together. It was so funny to them, which is understandable. And a few kids ignored it because they were fearful of what I was gonna do. And I have that presence. I can keep them on edge. Am I going to tackle somebody or am I going to hug them, right? They don't know, but I'm coming at them, right? But anyway, I flanked him and expressed the disappointment and made a connection with him with his two older brothers. And I just, said, what would your brothers say if they knew that you farted while I was talking? And he got real serious. And he said they'd be really upset with me. I said, yeah, what would they say? And he said they'd probably, he had some choice things that I pushed it out of him. And, he just was very honest. And I said, okay, well, I'm not going to mention it to him. I said, but I really like to you to understand that you need to be more respectful and mindful. So, that's communication, because his grandmother was on oxygen and that was the only adult that was in his life to take care of him. And she was literally, a few steps away from her deathbed. The mom was on drugs. She sells his Ritalin to make money to buy more drugs. The father was non-existent, and his two brothers were much older. And, so I think that he was telling me something with those actions. And you know what? Maybe I'm glad it happened. Because if it didn't, would I have known that he was in such crisis? I might not have taken the time.
What are some other behaviors that you see as red flags for kids to be concerned about, for kids we should check in with?
My response to that is every behavior. Like when behavior especially changes, it's really easy for us to point out the big ones, the Nicholas Cruzes, and say, yeah, that kid's trying to tell us something. That kid's desperate, he's hopeless, he's mentally ill. I was in a school last year, one of my favorite schools, I won't mention the name, and just up the road, a kid had brought a gun to school. This was in New York, and I couldn't wait to get there because I have such a tremendous amount of respect for the principal. And I wanted to know what he had to say because it was right up the road from his school. And when I got there, I was just blown away when 7 o'clock in the morning, and I'm like, hey man, did you hear about? And I saw something flash across his face, and I knew something. I just subconsciously knew something. And he's like, yeah, my son's a junior there. And I was like, whoa. I'm like, tell me about it. And then he made eye contact with me, and I could tell he didn't really want to discuss it. But he, like I said, I really admire this guy, and he laid it out there. He said, honestly, Tom, he said, when my son came home, I asked him about the kid, and he said, Dad, the kid's a scumbag. And this is a really good kid. He has really good grades and has a tremendous father. And he said, whoa, to his son, he said, well, what do you mean? He goes, I don't know, Dad, that's what everybody thinks. And then one of the most miraculous things happened. This guy took out his cell phone, this principal, and he handed it to me, and he pulled up an Instagram video of the kid a week before brandishing the gun, saying, if you don't leave my transgender friend alone, you're all going to be sorry. Now, we go to the very extreme in him actually bringing the gun to school, but I will guarantee you that there's not a kid in that school, or a bunch of them, that didn't know there were things going on. And what's the most supreme ethic? Right? Love. So what's this kid guilty of? Is he guilty of bringing a gun to school, or is he guilty of loving someone? And that was the only thing that his immature brain, in probably a very disorganized or chaotic life, that's the best it could come up with in today's world. And I'm not saying that's right, I'm not justifying it 1 ounce, but when Jason sends an email to that group, and I'm not trying to embarrass him here, that says, if I were Dan, I might have brought a knife to school too, that behavior is telling us something. And you say, what behavior should we pay attention? I say all of them. I say, if you know your kids, when your own daughter goes silent, even as a little girl, something's going on. What's wrong? Like, you just know that. Are we paying attention to those wilting flowers and paying attention to all those behaviors when it's really communication that they're giving us?